Well, good morning, everyone. We're ready to start our first plenary session for today, themed around Theology of Solidarity and Accompaniment. My name is Zane Yi, and I'll be the moderator for the session here. I currently serve as Associate Dean here and teach classes and Associate Professor in the School of Religion. And it is my honor to introduce our two speakers for this morning, two colleagues in the School of Religion. I'll just present a little bit of, share a little bit about them in the order they're going to be presenting in. Before I do that, I also want to welcome our online audience and just want to welcome you as well to the session. There is going to be a time for Q&A at the end of our time, and so if you have questions, we'll be watching the chat board. So if you have questions, you can enter them into the chat there, and we'll try to make time for them at the end. So a little bit about our presenters for today, or this morning. First, we have Yi-Shen Ma, who is the co-director for the Center for Christian Bioethics, also an assistant professor here in the School of Religion, teaching ethics. Yi-Shen is passionate about advancing mental health and health equity through his work at the center. He does so by facilitating conversations within and between healthcare institutions about health equity, trauma-informed care, racism, and the social impact of economic inequality. Here on campus, he teaches courses in bioethics and health disparities and spiritual care and to the healthcare professionals, where he has taught here, I believe, for the past 5 years. He'll be followed by Dr. Saúl Barceló, who is a director for the Center of Whole Person Care, also an assistant professor in the School of Religion at Loma Linda University. Saúl was born and raised in Mexico and migrated to the U.S. with his family in hopes of better opportunities, he writes. He has worked as a pastor for 8 years and is an ordained minister in the Seventh-day Adventist denomination, and then transitioned from pastoral care to working as a healthcare chaplain. His research areas and interests include the fields of liberation and political theologies, social ethics, and post-colonial theory. And in the future, Saúl looks forward to continue teaching and publishing on these topics, mentoring the next generation of scholars. Please join me in welcoming our two speakers for the plenary session.
Good morning. Again, welcome to our bioethics conference this year. If you want to access a couple of announcements, if you would like to access the digital version of the conference program, please scan the QR code that is in front of on the table in front of you. Later on, when we divide into concurrent sessions after the plenary, one of the sessions will remain here upstairs, and you can see the schedule over there right next to where the food is. And the second session will happen right downstairs on the 3rd floor. If you go down the stairs here with the elevator, it's a left and then another left going all the way down the hall, and you will see another sign there showing you where the location is at. Okay. So this morning, it's always hard to follow from a very inspiring worship message here from Dr. Carter. But I was thought that it would be a good idea for us to set the stage, the theological scaffolding conceptually of what we're trying to address in this conference, right? First of all, why solidarity, right? And what is it in the first place, right? Why is it important for Christians to think about this idea of solidarity? Dr. Saúl Barceló will be sharing this plenary with me, where I'll be setting the boring, dry philosophical scaffolding, and he will be filling the skeleton with the flesh of what it looks like in practice. That's how we divide up so I don't have to think about what it actually looks like in reality, right? So why solidarity? Well, we're all familiar with the blessed are the poor in Matthew 5, right? Blessed are the poor in the spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. When I was reading the Beatitudes many years ago, right, I thought about them as ways of measuring ourselves, of whether or not we have these character traits, right, in order to be good enough to enter into the kingdom of heaven. So in other words, I kind of read them as a kind of virtue ethics, right? Do I really have these virtues? How do I develop them? Over the last couple of years, I started to rethink what the Beatitudes really is about. And one of my greatest influence is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a Jewish theologian. One of the things he said that always struck me as really important is that, in his book, he's written many books on the prophets. And one of the things he said was that the way that the God of Israel was distinct from many other deities in the ancient Near Eastern world was that God was passionately interested in widows and orphans, right? Whereas the other gods are interested in other things like conquest, right, of different sorts, physical or sexual. But the God of Israel was interested deeply in the fate of the widow and the orphans. In other words, those who are marginal, those who are left out of the safety net that is available to everybody else in their society. As we can see in Isaiah, the prophet says, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, and plead the case of the widow. And then my other influence, Father Greg Boyle, right, who is the founder of the Homeboys Industries in Los Angeles, one of the largest and most successful gang rehabilitation and reentry programs in the United States, perhaps the most successful this nation has ever seen, right? He says that the Beatitudes is not a spirituality. After all, it is actually geography. It tells us not who we should be, but where to stand. That was really interesting to me, right? What if we look at the Beatitude not as a form of virtue ethics, right? We need to cultivate these virtues, but it tells us where we need to be in our society, at what location, where on the map we need to be. So the first answer to the question, why solidarity, is a theological one. We need to have solidarity because we stand at the margins of our society. And why do we do that? Why do we go to the margins of our society? Because that is where the barriers are dismantled, right? We go to the margins of society because that's where God is working, healing the world, right? The theologian and ethicist David Gushee calls this participatory grace, right? A lot of times in Protestant theology, we talk about God giving us grace, right? Sometimes the risk is that it devolves into cheap grace, in a sense that we can do whatever we want and God is willing to forgive us, right? Bonhoeffer is well known for talking about cheap grace. David Gushee says that, but rather God's grace is participatory. It's an invitation, right? God is there at the margins, healing our society. That is where you also need to be in order to participate in what God is already doing. So it is a theological message about being where God is already at, rather than a moral injunction for you to live up to a particular standard, right, or a virtue ethic. It is where you need to be, you and I need to be. So we stand at our margins and we show solidarity because that is where the barriers are dismantled. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what solidarity is in just a moment. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about poverty, right? When we read the Beatitudes, there's a couple of versions of that, right, in Luke and in Matthew. But biblical scholars have looked at this and say, what do we really mean when we say poverty in the Bible? And there are at least three different ways, three senses of the word poverty. The first one, it refers to those who are materially deprived. As you see in the example of Luke 20, right, talking about those who devour widows' houses and for a show, making lengthy prayers, these men will be punished most severely, right? Those who are materially deprived, those who don't have the material conditions in order to survive and to flourish. Secondly, the powerless. Those who lack, in other words, legal, social, and political agency, right? Those who are left out of being able to have a say in their community. That is just as important as those who are left out materially, right? As we know in social determinants of health research, it is not just about what you have or do not have, but it's also about your social status, right? And one of the things that social status tracks is how much say you have in your work environment, right? How much you're able to delegate to other people, how much you're able to be in control of your schedule, how much do you have a say in the environment that you're in. Powerlessness, then, is another sense of the word poverty in Scripture. The third one is the afflicted, and this one is one most familiar to healthcare people, right? Those who are afflicted, those who are sick, those who are suffering distress due to one thing or another, right? Those who are having perhaps dealing with physical, mental disabilities, or dealing with unfavorable environmental conditions. So those are the three senses of the word poverty. But then why should we care? My question has always been, right? In addition to just the theological message that God is already there in the margins, healing our society, prompting us to do the same through participatory grace, what exactly is our relationship to those who are on the margins? Is there a relationship at all? Or is it just a one-way street that we're called, those of us who are privileged enough to be here, to have an education, to be in positions of leadership? Is that our job to help, right? Those who are poor and suffering. And Luke chapter 6, I think this version of the Beatitudes is very revealing, right? Aside from just saying that blessed are the poor, right? Blessed are those who weep, there's a corresponding woe. You see later on in the chapter, woe to you who are rich, for you have rejected your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will be mourned and weep. Why does the text say that, right? Why is there a woe that goes along with the blessings? I think what Scripture reveals is that it is telling us that there is an intimate relationship, a relational connection between those who are sitting in the center as well as those who are on the margins, such that we cannot shirk. There is a joint responsibility that we have for one another that is unbreakable. And I think Father Guerrero calls it radical kinship, right? The assumption in the Scripture is that we all belong together. We are one family, one people. And if there is somebody in your community that is not doing well, it is because those of us who are in the community has somehow failed in part in our responsibility to ensure that that doesn't happen. There is a radical relationship between the poor and those who are rich, right? So as long as we allow that divide to continue, we're actually blaspheming against the radical kinship that we have with one another. That is the second part of the theological message. And the logic of the Bible is really quite interesting, as you can see in Deuteronomy 10 here. One of the things that God said to the people of Israel in order to treat their foreigners, well, this is a great evolution of theology in the ancient Near Eastern world, right? You are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. There's a unique concern for those who are other in your society, right? This is another way the God of Israel is different from other deities in the ancient world. In other words, the logic is this: you love the foreigners, you love those who are other because you are the foreigners. You have been there yourself. You are not immune to the conditions that ails and makes other people in those communities vulnerable. You are in the same lot, right? You belong in the same pot as those that we are called to serve and stand in solidarity with. This is quite different from the ancient Greek understanding of beneficence, right? I always like to begin, ethics classes talking about Aristotle, what he understood to be magnanimity, right? For Aristotle, it is wonderful to be a magnanimous person. That's one of the things that we should strive for, right, as people of virtue. But what it means to be a magnanimous person, first and foremost, means that you are not dependent on other people, right? That you're radically independent and self-sufficient. So a magnanimous person is very generous. So don't get me wrong, a magnanimous person is very generous. They like to give. They like to have big parties, right? But the reason for that is because they need to show other people how wonderfully independent they are. And so a magnanimous person feels like it's an insult if they were to be in a position where they would need the help of other people, right? It's a shameful thing to be in a position to need help from other people. And the theologian Luke Bretherton makes a very interesting distinction here. And that is contrasted with the biblical understanding of the order of blessing. Baraka is the Hebrew word here versus the Latin word benecium. Right? The baraka means that when you bless another person, right, in the Hebrew Bible, first you have received a blessing from God. So when you give a blessing, you are showing that you belong to the same order of blessing as the person that you are blessing. Means that you have first received something from God and you have received from other members in your community. So you're handing to another person what was given to you and what never belonged to you in the first place, right? That means that you share in this lot of vulnerability, right? That we all are vulnerable and we all need God's grace. And given a different set of circumstances, we might end up in the exact same place as our vulnerable brothers and sisters, right? And that's very clear also in social determinants of health study, what shows that, right, your zip code, right, is the strongest predictor of your health outcome. Not so much your genetic or whether or not you have access to health care, even though that plays a role, right, is your zip code, your neighborhood that makes the greatest difference. If we can look at the world that way, then we no longer see ourselves in a position of a moral, right, or social superiority over those we are serving. And that to me is what solidarity is all about. So this is kind of my definition. Solidarity is the ethical recognition of our interdependence and shared vulnerability. And here's the second part, which is just as important, and a positive commitment to ensure that others have the material, cultural, institutional means of flourishing befitting of human dignity. In other words, the image of God that is in every single one of us, right? There is an ancient patristic understanding of the image of God that is a little bit different from what we're familiar with. When we think about the image of God, we usually think about you as an individual have the image of God in you. There's definitely that connotation, right? But the early church fathers understood that the image of God is also a communal reality because God is a Trinity, right? So to have the image of God means that we must reflect back to God the community that we ought to be, namely one people. And Jesus prayed, let them be one, right? As the Father and I are one. So the image of God doesn't just refer to you individually as having human dignity, but it refers to us together as a whole, as a community, right? Reflecting the image of God as a collective, as a social reality. So this is recognizing that shared interdependence, and then after recognizing that, having a positive commitment to creating the conditions of possibility of flourishing. And what other greatest example than God's solidarity with human beings, right? Through the incarnation. Here are some points that I want to share. To be a God who becomes a human being is the greatest act of solidarity. As God enters into the world of suffering and pain, entering into the chaos and suffering of others. It means that if we were to worship of God, whose very highest revelation is the incarnation, that means that we must also bear witness, right, to the experience of those who are suffering in our midst. To journey with them so that they're not alone, right? So we have to do away with this idea that is very common in medical culture that if you can't cure, right, then there's nothing you can do, right? Then the job is done. It means to journey with them so that they are not alone. That is a healing activity, right? And to also at the same time, not only realizing that we are giving, but we're also receiving from those that we're giving to, as they remind us of our own humanity and our own vulnerability. The early church understood this very well, right? Early church understanding of being sick is that it reminds us of our mortality, of our vulnerability, and our shared reality with other human beings. And to acknowledge our vulnerability and to participate in God's solidarity. And then at the same time, to facilitate communion and empowerment when that's possible. So communion itself, reflecting back to God, the image of God that we all share, is itself an act of continuing to participate in the incarnate reality of God with us. as we can see here in Romans 8, right, gives us new light in terms of what it means. Neither in death nor in life, nor angels, nor principalities, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of our God is God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Because God is a God of solidarity. So how does it transform the principles of bioethics? And I'll be the first one to tell you, I'm not a principlist, right? So I'm not talking about bioethics can be reduced to these 4 principles or even a set of principles. But I think it serves as a great illustration of how the Christian story, the Christian narrative can transform how we relate to bioethics, right? So instead of thinking about autonomy as simply honoring individual freedom of choice, right? It is now a recognition of shared decision-making. And that means that autonomy is relational, right? It is negotiated. Not everybody is in a position to be able to act autonomously in accordance with their values, right? Because people may lack education. People may be suffering from all kinds of social pressures, from family ties, economic pressures, right, in the decision-making process. So what does it mean to help honor autonomy? Means to recognize our shared responsibility to empower one another to make the best decision possible. Beneficence means no longer just doing good like the magnanimous person would, right? It means to enter into the suffering or the chaos of another person, being willing to be shared in that vulnerability. Non-maleficence, right? Not just avoiding bad things, but to see Christ in the other, in advocating for change. And justice, building the beloved community. So I end here, and I'll head the time over to my colleague, Dr. Barceló.
So I know there's a lot going on here, and we do not want you to leave this building. But if you happen to walk on campus in the middle, just in front of the church, as you go into the medical center, you will see this beautiful sculpture. And while it's there to admire the talents of the artist, it's also there to remind us of our calling as a community of faith. Sometimes to remind us of our shortcomings, how our theology, how our own job descriptions, or our own limitations have forced us to oversee the needs of others. There is a fascinating article that was published. Actually, it was a study that was published a couple of decades ago. Perhaps you have heard of it or maybe not. You can always access it. It's available really easy online. But 2 social scientists by the name of Dr. John Darley and Dr. Daniel Batson decided to test this idea that it's not enough to just talk about service and meeting the needs of others. So they went to Princeton Seminary, recruited close to 70, I think 67 students. These are students who are called to ministry, called to make a difference. And so as they gathered the group, the 2 scientists says, you know what, we're going to do this little activity. Half of the group is supposed to be, coming up with a devotional, a sermonette on this passage of scripture. They gave him something. And then the other half was asked to reflect and also prepare a talk on that passage of Luke chapter 10, the Good Samaritan. Again, the social scientists were interested in testing something, so they decided to make it a little harder, divided the group now in 3 different categories. One category was told that, hey, listen, you are on time to your next appointment where you're going to give this talk. Go ahead, make sure you make it to the next room, and they gave the room number. Then the second group was told, you know what, they're waiting for you. There's time, but you want to make sure that you don't make people wait. And then the last group was asked to, hey, listen, you really have no time. You got to make it to that room. And again, they gave them the room, but that was not it. Part of the test was also to force everyone, the entire group, to go through this hallway of 4 feet, wide. I mean, I'm close to 6 feet, and I mean, you can imagine it's really narrow. And then in that hallway, they had somebody who was an actor who was moaning and crying, and it looked like he was in pain, asking for help. Now, it's getting complicated, right? It's just a test. No, now imagine the seminarians, they're doing their best, they're studying the passage of scripture, they're put together, and now as they started doing their things, eventually they gather the thoughts. And they realized there were three things that they were going to test. One, everyone, because it's part of our call as Christians, especially seminarians. Everyone's going to stop. Everybody's going to make a difference, right? Everybody's going to make sure that he or this individual is doing well. Also, they were going to test another thing, that it was, they were just going to make sure that especially those thinking about the Good Samaritan, I mean, this was a group that actually was going to do something about it. And then the last thing they wanted to test is like, well, sometimes when you're pressed by time, you may forget what you're here for, what your call or what your responsibility to the other. And I'm just summarizing here. Well, the results show that actually from the group who was not pressed for time, 2/3 actually stopped and check on this actor, on these men, from the group of people that actually were a little bit more rushed, but again had enough time. 48% actually stopped. But for the people who were rushing, 10%. Perhaps the study reminds us that if we're in a rush, if we're pressed for time, if we're so busy, we might forget why we're here. Psychologist, professor, and Christian author Richard Beck, in his blog Experimental Theology, reflects on this research study a few years later. He says the following: Jerusalem to Jericho makes this acute observation. Most of us pursue spirituality as a hobby. That is, life with God is pursued as a leisure activity. Why do I say this? Well, hobbies and leisure activities are what we pursue when we have free, expendable time in our hands, right? But when we have stuff to do, we tend to place our hobbies to the side. They're not allowed to interfere with our urgent agenda. If so, then, the Jerusalem to Jericho study suggests that helping others, for many, is a hobby. It's something to do on the weekends after church. When you have some spare time, this is a penetrating diagnosis. Too many religious people treat altruism as a hobby rather than as an essential and urgent feature of their life. Wow. A lot to unpack on that. Perhaps what we are hoping that we get out of this is not just so we feel bad and but we evaluate how we use our resources, our time management, our skills, our knowledges, so we can actually do what we are called to do. There is a term that is mainly used in social circles within Catholic faith, accompaniment. It's a term that it comes from the Latin word, and other denominations use it. Perhaps they use it as a walking with, journeying with. This term accompaniment comes from the Latin, just says to break bread. And in ancient times, you knew that, breaking bread was not something that you did like quick. You go to Del Taco, you get a burrito, boom, you're on your way out. No. Making food takes time, or took time in the past. You can't afford to go to the microwave or the fridge and just get things quick. So it was an intimate act where you share with someone else, just like prayer or worship, or even sharing the bed with your partner. That sharing bread, that was almost an act of worship. Accompaniment. And so that is what we are inviting all of us to think about. And again, while it's common with, especially in Catholic social circles, it's time for us to be reflecting on how we can implement that within our healthcare systems, also within our own church communities. Sorry. I guess it's going backwards. How do you go back? We didn't learn that in grad school. Either that or I skipped. No, one more. A few more. I think it's going back. Oh, there it is. There. Okay, cool. All right. Oh, we are good, I think. Okay, sweet. So Dr. Jenny Weiss, she was actually a Dominican laid person, practical theologian, advisor to Dr. Paul Farmer during his time working at the UN and doing amazing things. I'll talk a little more about Dr. Paul Farmer and his work around the world. But in this introduction to the book that Dr. Paul Farmer wrote with Dr. Gustavo Gutierrez, as they addressed from the theological and from the medical perspective, how should we address the needs of the poor, the most marginalized members of society? She says this as she explains a little bit more this concept of accompaniment that we want to highlight during our time this morning. The practice of accompaniment is highly personal and deeply relational. Accompaniment of the lonely poor involves walking with, not behind or in front, but besides a real person on his or her own particular journey, in his or her own particular place and time, at his or her own particular pace. We don't have time for that. Accompanying others in the struggle for survival does not have a beginning or an end. It's not a 5-year strategy or a 10-year plan, and there is no outside plan to be imposed. It often means being present to terrible suffering, being thrown into chaotic circumstances, encountering unexpected problems and difficult situations with no easy solution. And yet, accompaniment, the act of walking with another, in the words of the American-Cuban theologian Roberto Goizueta, walking with another, always a fundamentally religious, sacramental act. Now, this, again, is not limited to Catholic social circles. It's embedded into the scripture that we all read as students, as followers of Christ. And I know my colleagues, Dr. Carter and already Dr. Ma, just mentioned briefly about this act of accompaniment that is embodied in the life of Christ. Some of us remember John opening up, trying to find words to describe what really took place when God, the divine, came to this world. And I believe that verse 114, chapter 114 in the Message Bible really captures that. The word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood, took our zip code, decided to be part of what's going on, not just as I'm on the hill, I'll come and check out on the weekends to see what's going on. I am part of you. Perhaps a reference to the Hebrew Bible, how God journeyed with the Hebrew people as they made it to their home. Accompaniment is a biblical model, something that we should be reviewing. There's also a cultural, because of time, I'm not going to dwell a lot on the biblical model, and also the cultural model of accompaniment. I thought about putting two good examples. One, I may ask you to see if you're still awake and you're still with me, but I'm just curious to see if by any chance, without using AI, you can definitely find out who said the following. Like everyone, I wanted to succeed. I dream of becoming a famous medical research scientist. I dream of working in Barceló to discover something which would be used to help humanity, which signified a personal triumph for me. But then something happened. He says, I came into close contact with poverty, hunger, and disease, with the inability to treat a child because of lack of money, with the stupefaction provoked by a continual hunger and punishment, to the point that a father can accept the loss of a son as an important accident, as occurs often in the downtrodden classes of our American homeland. And I began to realize at that time that there were things that were almost as important to me as becoming a famous or making significant contribution to the medical science. I actually wanted to help those people. Curious to know if you can think of the person. Perhaps the most famous physician. I put a picture there in case you recognize him. Yeah, He actually had gone to medical school. His goal was to be a revolutionary doctor. As he took 1 year off from medical school and began to travel with his friend in a motorcycle, he realized that, hey, what's going on? How come these people don't have access to medical treatment? His life changed. He wanted to be a dermatologist. He was interested in especially in leprosy and other things. And his life changed as he came in contact with those who need it. You can judge his actions. You can agree or disagree. Nevertheless, a model of accompaniment within our culture. One more. Perhaps this is something that is more commonly known within theologians and especially liberation theologians, even though Oscar Romero never agreed with liberation theologians. But he was appointed by the Vatican to lead his country of Salvador in 1977. You know why? Because he was the safest candidate. I often think about my own journey and wonder, am I here because I am the safest candidate? It took him a while, and he began to listen to the concerns of his church and his congregation. And he realized that he needed to change his approach. Well, at the beginning, he ministered mainly to elite members of his society. With time, things began to change. And he used his position of influence, power, to communicate that we gotta worry more about not just sin and eternal life, but everyday life. Not an easy transition as he lost and gained more enemies. You probably can learn a little bit about his outcome. In March 24th of 1980, he was shot to death as he was ministering to somebody in a funeral as he spoke about the atrocities of what was taking place in his country. Yet, the reason he changed from being a safe candidate of accompaniment model to somebody who actually embodied this was because he stopped by and listened to the concerns of others, which is something that we don't have time for. Who has time to listen to the concerns? We have an agenda and we're the experts, right? Psychologist Mary Watkins, in her book, Mutual Accompaniment and the Creation of the Commons, invites us to think about this. Accompaniment begins with stopping and noticing, crossing over the invisible lines that separate us, making time to connect, to understand and respond. It depends on learning about the experience of people and listening for the kinds of assistance that are welcome, if any. It also crucially depends on understanding that as far as our individual faith seems from one another, they're ultimately intimate, connected. I think the pandemic reminded us of that in a sad way. To walk right by, to pretend that others do not exist, to develop blind spots for large portions of our communities and our neighbors, humans and other than human animals, compromises our personal integrity. She concludes this in her book. Those of us who hold various privilege have too often become accustomed to two options. One, keeping ourselves apart from situations where others are in need, and as though our engagement would compromise our own happiness. Or entering into situations naively unaware of the historic context that has created the suffering and the structural changes that are necessary to address. Yeah, history matters. But as we think of healthcare, well, we have run out of time. But I do want to highlight the work of someone who had tried to embody this in his practice. The work of Dr. Paul Farmer, who I mentioned to you, passed away in February 2000, I believe it was last year, 2022. His book, To Repair the World, he tries to define from his own terms, his own understanding, because you have to understand that it's not something he learned in medical school. It's something he learned as he moved to the global south and served in Haiti and Peru and different countries in Africa. He says accompaniment is an elastic term. It has basic everyday meaning. To accompany someone is to go somewhere with him or her, to break bread together, to be present on a journey with a beginning and an end. There's an element of mystery, of openness, of trust in accompaniment. The accompaniator says, I'll go with you and support you in your journey wherever it leads. I'll share your faith for a while. And by a while, I don't mean a little while. Accompaniment is about sticking with a task until it's deemed completed, and not by the accompaniator, but by the person being accompanied. In another book, and a book I quoted early, in The Company of the Poor, he says the following: solidarity is a precious thing. People enduring great hardships often remark that they are grateful for the prayers and good wishes of fellow human beings. But when sentiment is accompanied by the goods and services that might diminish unjust hardship, surely it is enriched. To those in great need, solidarity without the pragmatic component can seem like such a much abstract pity. And briefly, as we try to conclude just this brief conversation on solidarity and accompaniment, be mindful that this model will not bring profit to our systems. It may bring impact, it may bring salvation, but not profit. So if you're thinking about implementing or at least beginning to brainstorm on how we can do this, perhaps be mindful there will be resistance. It's not embedded in our culture, medical culture, even church culture. But I conclude with this. Dr. Barbara Thompson and Dr. George Lipsey, in their book Insubordinate Spaces, Improvisation and Accompaniment for Social Justice, they say the following: accompaniment is not generally a valued practice in the activities of competitive neoliberal societies. In a world of market times and marketplaces, people are encouraged to think of themselves as entrepreneurs of their own identities, careers, and public images. The dominant reward structures cultivated antagonism and aggression among individuals. Workers compete with each other for malmanagement's favor. Students learn to desire higher grades than their classmates. Scholars compete with colleagues for prestige and reward. Poor people are pitted against each other as they scramble for scarce resources and symbolic emblems of prestige. Yet, in the survival strategies of the poor, in shop floor collaborations among workers, and in the practice of teaching and learning, what matters most is how the pieces fit together and what people can create collectively. Accompaniment can thus be the basis of a powerful counterculture inside communities, work sites, and schools. And I would add healthcare systems. It can help us discover parts of ourselves that we did not know were there by elevating the moral over the material. In a society that constantly urges people to have more, the real task, as Archbishop Oscar Romero insisted, is to learn how to be more. As I conclude, all of us can make a difference. All of us are called to accompany other. Perhaps what we need to think is about collaborating. And I think that is the vision of these gatherings. Leave you with this last quote from Dr. Paul Farmer. It's easy to be dismissive of accompaniment in a world in which technical expertise is advanced as the answer to every problem. But expertise alone will not solve the difficult problems. This was the long, hard lesson of the earthquake. He's reflecting on his time in Haiti. We all waited to be saved by expertise, and it never came. Then he concludes with this: accompaniment does not privilege technical prowess above solidarity or compassion or a willingness to tackle what may seem to be insuperable challenges. It requires cooperation, openness, and a teamwork of the sort of so many of you cherish. Much more can be accomplished looking forward with an open source view of the world. Thank you.
So thank you, Saúl and Yi-Shen, for explaining these really important concepts, their theological connections, as well as challenging us to imagine what it would look like to live this out. So we have some time for some questions. So I'd like to just invite any of you who may have a question or a comment about what you've heard. You're welcome to address both presenters or just indicate who you're wanting to engage. And I would extend the same invitation to those of you who are joining us online. We'll be monitoring the Q&A board. Does that mean I have to ask the first question? Well, let's start off having you guys engage each other a little bit. So it seems like the concepts of solidarity and accompaniment are connected, but are also distinct. So we'd just welcome you to kind of reflect on each other's presentations. So Yi-Shen, if you could comment a little bit about what you see in accompaniment that connects to solidarity, and Saúl will invite you to do the same the other way around.
Yeah, I think these concepts are distinct, but I see that accompaniment is sort of a practical application, one way that solidarity is embodied and operationalized in kind of the clinical context, right? So I think solidarity is sort of the more encompassing concept that includes accompaniment is one of its subcategories. Yeah, so that's why I think the reason why we framed our panel this morning this way is because I think that so what Saúl brings to the table is that it really shows like what this looks like in reality, right? So
yeah, and as I think of accompaniment, it's interesting that I think of my own journey as a chaplain for I had the privilege of being part of the team for 10 years here, almost 10 years, and it's just I often wonder, what could I bring to the table? You see all these amazing physicians and nurses, respiratory therapists, especially when there's a code, everybody's rushing. And you're like, oh, what do I do? It's like everybody's saving the patient, great. But then the family is broken in the side, trying to put the pieces together. And I realized as a chaplain, it was something practical. I can just carry myself to stand next to them. I may not be able to change the outcome of the patient. I don't have all the wonderful skills that my friends, the physicians, the nurses, respiratory therapists have or bring, but I can stay next to that person until they need to. And so, yeah, it's definitely a practical tool, but I think also everyone can do it without having to understand everything there is or align in belief systems. And I can just be with you. We'll figure it out together.
And if I may add to what you're saying here too, is like one of the things I'm doing now is I'm training to become a social worker, right? And one of the most frustrating things when we go into clinical context is that there is a lot of problems that is outside of our control, right? No matter how much we talk about advocacy and change, a lot of changes won't come for a long time if they come at all, right? So, we talk about in a clinical context, moral injury and burnout, right? Some of it is due to the fact that it's difficult for us to make meaning in those contexts when we see all of our efforts thwarted by the larger forces that we have no control over, right? So what I found very appreciative of the idea of accompaniment is it allows me to see what I'm doing, even if it doesn't lead to a positive clinical outcome, still a worthy enterprise in the sense that I'm journeying and I'm bearing witness to the suffering of the person who is sitting in front of me, even if I'm not able to fix the situation. So I think that to me has been a great spiritual resource to help me deal with the stresses that comes with that things that people see in those contexts. Yeah.
Okay, so we are getting some questions. I was going to go again, but we'll follow up on this once the questions run out. So let's pass it on. Should I pass the mic back so everybody can hear, including those online? So I'll come out to you. So.
Thank you so much. I appreciate both of your talks. One of the risks of accompaniment and of solidarity with others is that we may occasionally partner with some bad characters. Is that a risk? And if so, how can you help us mitigate that risk?
It's a great question. I know, Dr. Carr, you were gonna make it easy on us. It's interesting. I reflect on the life of Dr. Paul Farmer. And as he embodied this in his practice, especially as he established, partners in help, you realize that the work he did in the countries that they did their thing or they continue to do their thing, is governments that they don't always align philosophically with, the US or anything. I mean, you think about what they were doing in Russia, again, in other countries, Latin America and different countries in Africa. It was not necessarily they had to align everything in order to get access to serve people in need. And so if we wait until we always agree, I'm thinking of my own marriage, is like, we're never gonna get everything done. But at some point, you just gotta move forward. You have to do certain things, especially when we come. And I think this is crucial. When there's people suffering, all these ideologies need to be put to the side, and we need to be at the service of the marginalized, at those who are suffering. But when we're too removed, it's easy to debate. It's easy to go back and forth. But when you're in front of somebody who's literally dying, it's a different story.
All right, I saw a hand up here. I saw a hand over there. So we'll go back and to the side.
As a professor here at the School of Religion for several years, I had an idea of getting a conference on free will, and I was able to get a colleague up the freeway, Philip Clayton at Claremont, to join me, and we did have a conference, and some of you were a part of that. And I wrote the introduction to the book that came out of it, and I confessed a personal benefit, and it's very much related to this, and that is my conviction, more so than one of my colleagues who joined me in that project, who is sitting here at one of these tables, feel that I'm much more determined by other forces than something within me. The notion of nurture and nature, I think, goes far toward determining who I am. And it made me feel that it made me more modest about my accomplishments and more forgiving of my failures for myself and for others. And it made me think we're all in this together because we didn't choose to be who we are. The person who is afflicted or the person who is so-called successful. So we're in this together. For me, that was a great conceptual contribution to my need to be more charitable and involved in my community. And I'm wondering what you think. Whether you think the idea of free will, which conservative Christians are pretty strong on that, whether you think the way that we come out on that issue, a rather heady conceptual issue, has anything to do with how we approach ministry.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. Thank you, Dr. Walters, for that comment. I think one of the great philosophical debates in our culture at large, right, perhaps in our political discourse, is, on one side is the fear that we will lose agency, right? If we say that social determinants is real, if we say that, people don't get to choose their mental health or their trauma, then human beings are just machines, right? And then we are not able to have any agency, right? On the other hand, when we focus so much on agency and freedom, then we neglect all of the forces that put pressure on bringing us to this point in our life, right? Martha Nussbaum actually, I think, wrote a very helpful article saying that why do we have to choose one or the other? Because human beings are simultaneously agents as well as victims of their circumstances, right? We don't have to create a false dichotomy there, in my view, right? That we, and actually, if we look at some of the social science literature, we have those of us who are educated, right, and are successful have a cognitive bias towards actually our agency. Whereas those who are on the lower socioeconomic status have a more awareness of what communal support means for them to flourish as individuals, right? So I think that we need to talk about who we're talking about here. If we're talking to each other here at the table, I think we need to focus on what's outside of our control, because that's outside of our purview and our experience. For those who I'm working with as a psychotherapist trainee, right, I'm trying to empower their agency. I'm trying to say, you can make a choice. There is something you can do about the situation. So I don't see them as mutually exclusive, but that's a very short answer to your very profound question.
Yeah. So, Dr. Barceló, you mentioned a couple of things. One, you wondered if you were a safe person, and that caught my interest. And also, you had one slide on resistance. You didn't say much about it. So, I'm just curious about if you'd say a little bit more about that. In other words, we're here in this institution where the mission is clear to make humanity whole. Where's the resistance? Is it institutional? Is it within your own, trying to work out your own salvation, so to speak? What would you say a few words about that?
Oh, that's a great question. And yeah, we were running out of time, so I just skip a couple of things. I just wanted to highlight that, especially when it comes down to ideas, it's easy to debate them. But then when we talk about budget, it's a different story. And that's maybe where we begin resistance. There's also culture. There's also theological views, and that will create resistance too. Everybody's aligning before we can dive in and help that person. Are they going to be members? Are they going to be coming to, no, nothing's guaranteed. It's just that is your calling. So there's going to be multiple ways in which, but I think as we think of systems, definitely budget is always what keeps us in check. But I think as people of faith, our theology sometimes may limit us on what we could be doing as we collaborate with others. And then also we have to be aware of our own cultural bias. And so that could influence how we approach things. So I wish I had more time to dive on that. But yeah, I just wanted to throw that little warning. But I think budget will always keep us in check.
If I may also butt in, one of the persistent resistance one feels in the classroom sometimes in the Adventist world is that our eschatology sometimes work against, right, our desire to make this world a better place, right? Because we're looking for Jesus coming back, right? And that means that everything will be fixed at some point in perhaps the near future. And that means that we don't need to take care of each other and our things here in the meantime. To me, that is a profoundly that to me is implicitly a profound hatred for creation, right? For me, that if God calls creation good, it doesn't matter what your eschatology is, right? We have a responsibility to live into that reality, to live into the kingdom that is coming. So if we hate our earth now, what makes you think that you will love it in the eschaton, right? So I think there is a direct connection there that oftentimes gets missed in the discussion.
All right, I'm going to go back to the other side of the room. We have time for one or two more questions or comments.
Thank you. The late Don Jernigan always used to say that in order to do good, we have to do well. And I'm addressing your comment, Saul, about this tension, where we run into a conflict with our desire to be all that we've just talked about, to do the accompanying and to be in solidarity, but at what cost? And so, you've got the back and forth, do we build this new building? Do we refurbish this new tower? Or do we invest the capital somewhere else that can do some significant good in the community? How should we manage that tension?
It's interesting because it's one of the principles of justice that Dr. Ma was talking about. Justice, we do understand that we have limited resources, that we have to be honest. But as people with responsibility, hopefully with knowledge and a calling, we are called and invited to make sure we're stewards of those few resources that we have. The issue is that those resources tend to stay within one segment of our population. And some families do enjoy all access to healthcare, while others, they don't even know where to begin. And yes, we can keep claiming we have limited resources. the reality is that, yes, we recognize that, but we also have a call to be pushing beyond just his family and to maybe start moving beyond the street, the other side of the freeway, a zip code, and begin to see what are the needs, what have we missed? And within our limited resources, we're going to make sure and recognize that you and all of us are created in the image of God, deserve the same or similar access to care. And that's where we are called to manage that, but without forgetting the needs. And I think, I don't know if that begins to answer the question. I don't think that's going to be justice, but.
Yeah, I don't presume to be able to speak to those of you who are in healthcare leadership about how to manage these tensions. One of the most illuminating books I've read about these tensions is the Balboni's book, right? Hostility to Hospitality. And in that book, they talk about every healthcare institution navigate these 4 different forces, right? You have the bureaucratic forces, right? The paperwork stuff. You have the profit force, right, about financial feasibility, and you also have research and the drive for research, and a lot of times these forces are joined, right, hand in hand. But there's also a 4th force that is the force of hospitality and compassion. And for the Balbonis, it is really rooted in the ancient Christian tradition of healthcare that is about reaching out to the community, to those who are on the margins. The shift in modernity has been that these other 3 forces have become the priority for most institutions, right? So, what I would add to that analysis is that oftentimes we backed ourselves into a corner and we design a system where these values get marginalized, right? And when we do that, it kind of snowballs into, okay, now we have to focus on these priorities because we backed ourselves into that corner. So there's a tendency to be short-sighted rather than long-term oriented. One of the things that people talk about in social determinants of health is that actually in the long run saves a lot of money, but it takes a lot of upfront investment, right? Is that when you address social determinants, if you create better housing, better community, better neighborhood, address racial inequality, it actually in the long term leads to better health outcome, right? So what do we really care about? Is it health outcome, right? And even if we can achieve that, actually leads to saving a lot of money financially too. But again, I'm not a healthcare leader, so I would love to pick your brains on how you would do that in your particular context throughout this conference.
Okay, I think this will be our last question or comment.
Dr. Barceló, you mentioned some significant people in South America who accompanied, various people in need. One of the challenges of people who accompany others is getting wounded. And Jesus is probably one of the greatest examples of that. So I think as we look at accompanying people, how do we reach out into a community of accompaniers?
Can you say the last part again? Sorry, Dr. Liebling.
Yeah, as we accompany people, how do we reach out to a community of accompaniers?
Ooh. That's profound, coming from a licensed marriage and family therapist who probably has a calling of doing that here within our community. That's profound. I'm thinking of Henry Nouwen's book, The Wounded Healer. A clear reminder is that as we give others, we're giving a little bit of ourselves, so we're emptying ourselves. So definitely we got to be thinking of resources, just like as we're providing resources for those who don't have it, but also resources for those who are giving. Who I would love to learn more from you on how we can do that. That's a good question. Again, may require a little bit more brainstorming, but it goes back to the idea that all these, how we solve issues is not individually. And while we have our disciplines and our expertise, the only way we can make differences is when we collaborate with one another. And I think the pandemic was a clear reminder that at the beginning was happening in another side of the world. It doesn't matter. But then suddenly it matters, because now all of us are affected. So we begin to use our resources. We begin to brainstorm. Sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't work. And so that is the same way when we talk about, caring for our community. I'm not saying there's just one clear plan that you copy and paste, but at least you're sensitive that all of us somehow are interconnected. So.
Okay, well, that does it for our session today. Please join me in thanking our presenters. And thank you for joining in the conversation. We'll continue with our next session at 10:15. So take a few minutes to grab something to drink or take a wellness break.